All right, hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our CAN-SEB webcast for the month of February. My name is Jack Koziarski. I'm a CAN-SEB research associate and a PhD student at the University of Western Ontario. Our topic for today's webcast is police legitimacy and procedural justice, and our guest for today is Dan Jones. Dan has worked in the justice system for 24 years, 3 years as a correctional officer and 21 years as a police officer, obtaining the rank of inspector. He earned his master's degree at the University of Cambridge in applied criminology, receiving the Wakefield Scholarship, and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Huddersfield, where he received the Secure Societies Institute Scholarship. Currently, Dan's focus of study is the victim-offender overlap and looking at how research and evidence-based practice can create positive systems change. So welcome, Dan, and thank you for taking time out of your day to take part today.
Thank you very much.
No worries. Okay, you ready to get started?
You bet.
Okay, so what is procedural justice, and what is police legitimacy, and how do these two things relate?
For sure. Procedural justice is basically the interaction that the police have with the people, and that's a conversation we'll get more into that later. And police legitimacy are the police seen as a legitimate power holder within the context of public safety for the community. Without police legitimacy, it erodes everything for policing, and police are actually unable to effectively do their job.
Okay, and can we quantify procedural justice and police legitimacy? Are we able to do that, or is that more of a qualitative kind of aspect?
There is a way to quantify it. If you look at Leger, and if you're not familiar with the company Leger that does brand management in the country of Canada and actually all over the world, Leger looks at different factors that lead way more towards the concept of legitimacy than just the satisfaction surveys that are done by most police agencies. A lot of police agencies will do satisfaction surveys, and in that they will say, oh yeah, we have a 94% satisfaction rating. The questions asked in those aren't actually going to lead towards saying that 94% of people see police as legitimate. When you go do a deeper dive between trust and legitimacy, trust can be talked about like legitimacy, but it's not necessarily legitimacy. So if you get into a car accident today and you need to get a file number for your car to get your car fixed, you trust that when you walk into a police station, they're going to give you that file number. What you don't necessarily trust, when the legitimacy piece comes in, take sexual violence victims for an instance. 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted. 5% of them report that to the police for a very, very, very different reasons. But one of those reasons oftentimes comes back to how they're treated by the police and how they see the police will see them or make them feel or re-victimize them. And that's where legitimacy differs from the concept of satisfaction. So it can be quantified and researched, but we just aren't doing a great job of that in the policing context right now.
Okay, and are these two aspects, police legitimacy and procedural justice, are they universal concepts, or can they be influenced by certain factors that, for example, might be local to a particular jurisdiction?
So I think that's an interesting concept. I think they are universal concepts. But I also believe that they can be influenced by different jurisdictions. And you look at the things that also play a factor in these: bias awareness, cultural safety, trauma-informed. Those types of things actually play into how our procedural justice is executed. It also plays into the fact that how people perceive the police officer that they're dealing with, and thereby the police agency that they're impacted by. So they're not isolated to each other, but yeah, they are universal. And you can look at the concept of procedural justice in Sweden, where you take Sweden, for instance. One of the issues that Sweden has is they have a really high Somali population that hasn't been well integrated. And there's been some research done on that, and that lack of integration results in numerous things: victimization, non-reporting. And we have the same issues in Canada with our Indigenous population, where we have a population of people that is incarcerated higher, not because they're bad or worse, but oftentimes because that police legitimacy piece doesn't play into that community. And we need to work harder as police agencies to ensure that we are seen as legitimate by those populations.
Okay, and could you expand on procedural justice a little bit? So what are some of the main tenets of procedural justice, and can you provide some examples?
Absolutely. There's really 4 main tenets to procedural justice, and one of them is a participation or a voice, so that the individual who's being impacted, and this goes for accused, victims, witnesses, general population, but that their side of the story has been considered when decisions are made. People want to be participating in their own public safety. They want to be participating in their own legal experience. If people feel that there's an instantaneous, no, it's our side of the story and that's all we need, that really isn't procedural justice, and it erodes it. The second one is neutrality. A police officer has to come off as and seen as neutral, and we talk about this all the time. Bias. There's a lot of police agencies that talk about being bias free. Well, that's an impossibility. We can't be bias free. That's just not how our psychology is made up. But we can be bias aware, and we can talk about that. And I think that's the best way in training or teaching or working with police officers, is the concept of explaining what bias awareness is and understanding how to check those biases. So when you're in a situation that you may be uncomfortable with, or you know you have a bias, that you're aware of those biases and you can be neutral when dealing with an individual, because that neutrality becomes significantly important when it comes to people seeing the police as legitimate, and that procedural justice piece. That neutrality leads into conveying trustworthy motives. And I think one of the and I say this often, one of the biggest words that's not used in policing is compassion. And it's one of those things that I think we really need to look at bringing into as almost a competency. I know the London Metropolitan Police recently, when they brought out new competencies, they put compassion in there as a competency. And when you're conveying those trustworthy motives, and people see that you are compassionate and you are genuine and you actually care about the well-being of the individual, and again, I stress this is the individual who would be classed as the offender at that moment, the victim at that moment. There needs to be compassion for both sides of the legal world. And the fourth and final piece is dignity. Treatment with respect and upholding people's rights. Dignity is when people feel, if you do all those four things when you're dealing with someone, when the police are dealing with someone, they are going to leave that moment in time feeling like there was some procedural fairness and justice in relation to that interaction with the police. Tom Tyler always says every single interaction a police have with the public is a socializing experiment that either erodes or increases public trust.
And it sounds like there's a lot of micro impacts in what you just explained. So what are some of the macro impacts of procedural justice?
100%. Micro impacts, you're right. And oftentimes I use the example of the body shop with the inside out marketing, where I've been in situations like this in my own experience in policing. I spent a lot of time working with organizations like the Ventura Traditional Healing Society, where you walk into a room and you're a police officer, and there's people in the room that have had negative experiences and heard about negative experiences. And so you have those micro impacts, and by the end of a 3-hour session, people are leaving that room. You're actually getting disclosures of offenses that have been committed against them, and you change the mood in the room. But what happens is those people end up going back to other people and telling those people, hey, actually you can trust the cops, or you can call this police service, or I actually receive really good service. And you have that. It becomes difficult. The macro stuff becomes difficult to impact because the media comes into play, and that becomes a real challenge for the police. And if you look at this whole concept of police legitimacy, there's a watershed moment, if you will. And there's some research that was done that showed in 1980, people were concerned mostly with criminal deterrence, making sure that the people did not commit crimes. And then really what police legitimacy was kind of down here, no one really had a concern. But in 1991-92, those two lines intersected. And then from that moment on, police legitimacy became the concern, and actually the actions of the individuals that are doing criminal behavior became the less of the concern. And that's, I suggest, is a big media moment. And if you look at that history and time, that was Rodney King. Rodney King occurred in that time frame. And when that time frame happened, it really changed the conversation of the community and policing around legitimacy, and really made the police a lot more accountable. Not a bad thing. But it does become a challenge, because to try to have that macro impact, we have to deal with media at times. And Wesley Scogan's research out of Northwestern University talks about, and I think he's done it 7 different times in 3 different countries, and it's always the same ratio. You need 14 positive news stories for every 1 negative news story to change the way police are seen from a legitimate perspective. So it's an uphill battle for the police, for sure.
Okay. And can procedural justice also maybe reframe some of the notions about the role of police officers? So for example, discussions about the warrior versus guardian mentality. Can procedural justice affect that in a way?
100%. And it's about shifting some culture almost. And I say back to where we started. And when we started, were Robert Peel, which everyone's familiar with, the police are the public and the public are the police quote. There's a North American, they call him the American Robert Peel. His name is August Volman. And August Volman said, if a police officer, he was the chief of police of Chicago, if a police officer in their first year does not arrest somebody, they're doing their job, because their job isn't to detect and arrest, their job is to prevent crime. Mm-hmm. And I think what's happened, and it's what's happened has been as a result of necessity at times, is we've seen a militarization in our police, which has somewhat eroded our ability to go back to what we were doing. And sometimes that's the firepower that the individuals have that the police are arresting. You look at the bank robbery in LA in the 90s. But it really does have to reframe, we do have to reframe that warrior to guardian mindset. And I know that was brought up in the 21st Century Task Force on Policing by Obama. And that guardian mindset is super important. It's super important for the community. We're not at war. We're here to ensure public safety and work together with our partners and collaborate and not over-criminalize certain populations. And I know that that's one of the things that impacts policing in the negative is you have homeless and addicted populations that get affected by police, and people that work in those industries see that, and we're incarcerating people that we're mad at, not people that we're scared of. That's a quote from Chief Dale McPhee from the Edmonton Police Service recently, and I think that quote sums up what we need to do from a policing perspective.
So you touched about the media a little bit a few minutes ago. So would you be able to kind of expand on that a little bit and kind of discuss how the media can affect procedural justice and police legitimacy?
Absolutely. One of the things that happens, and this is where the police get in a really tough position. Investigative integrity is the top priority for all investigations, and even if it's let's say it's a complaint against a police officer and it's highly touted in the media, and then the investigation occurs, and actually what was reported in the media isn't actually the facts. Mm-hmm. The investigation proves it wasn't. Well, that's 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road. That story is not picked up. What's remembered is the negative first story and the impact of that negative first story, not the true investigation later down the road. I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that there's not times where the police do things wrong and are in the media. The flip side of that coin is, let's say a homicide investigation occurs, or an aggravated assault investigation occurs, and someone comes out with a story going, this is what happened, and this is what happened, and the police didn't do what they should have done, and then the media comes out and it erodes. And I'll use Colton Boushie as a perfect example of that. In Colton Boushie file, I truly believe the police did their job. They did an investigation, they laid charges, and the charges got stayed. Unfortunately, legal cynicism leads into police legitimacy because police become that face of the justice system. So not only do we wear in the media, we wear what happens with our own organizations, with our own people, the negative impacts those things have. We also wear some of the negative impacts that the justice system carries out, and then people come and protest at a police station when really the police actually did the role that they were supposed to do, and they laid those charges and they brought those charges before the court. And media kind of tends to lean towards the police because we're the easiest justice group to protest, I would suggest.
Okay. And so procedural justice itself is kind of a new-ish concept within policing. So what would you say are some of the challenges or barriers with respect to implementing procedural justice specifically?
So the biggest challenge and barrier is culture change. So you're looking at a way to deal with people and a way to address things in a more compassionate, kind way. And I'm not saying the police haven't been kind in the past, but it's, you look at TV and we can go just the facts, ma'am, right? And those types of events. And it's how do you implement something at this stage when we have, in my organization, 125 years of experiences. And how do we change that conversation? How do we get members to understand the importance of procedural justice and really the importance of police legitimacy? And the concern sometimes becomes that these words become just used, regardless of not necessarily knowing the meaning. And I say this about evidence-based policing sometimes, where it's become a catchphrase. And I think we as organizations and policing and policing culture have to make sure that those words mean something, and that we look towards training and embedding procedural justice practices throughout our organization.
So you kind of just touched upon how important it is for officers to understand these terms. But then also, how important is it for officers to carry the understanding of those terms into their daily duties?
It's extremely important, and you can actually see the impact of when it's done. Lorraine Mazerow did a a randomized control trial in Queensland. It was called the Queensland Community Engagement Trial, and it was really around check stops and drink driving. And what they did was 50% of the people stopped. Either some just got stopped and some even got charged. They got the business as usual, basically pulled over, and the other people had a procedural justice script. And that script was basically going back to participation of voice, neutrality, trustworthy motives, and dignity, explaining why they were stopping, talking about death and danger on the road, and having a very procedurally just conversation with those folks, and giving them participation. There was a significant change when they surveyed the folks after, and the people that had the procedural justice script. And interestingly enough, they actually spent a significantly more amount of time with the police. And the police over here, we were thinking, no, people aren't going to like that because they want to get going. They don't want to be stopped for long. So it's very important. It's important to know that this has an impact, and it's important to know that what that impact can have. And I think that leads into the other thing, that when you look at the concept of procedural justice, is trauma awareness and being trauma informed. And I think you can blend those things together, because I think one of the failings or mistakes that police cultures have made for a long time is not knowing the client, not knowing who your offender is. And we're not psychologists, we're not social workers, but having an understanding of the person's history, knowing that the vast majority of offenders were victims prior to their very first detected offense, that becomes significantly important, and how that moment in time can actually be an impactful time that actually can prevent the person from committing crime later.
And can perceptions or understandings of police legitimacy and procedural justice differ depending on rank within a police service?
Absolutely, and because I also think they differ. They also differ on experiences, and I think one of the things that we have to be aware of, especially when you look at rank and you look at your station in the organization, is that concept of internal or self-legitimacy. And that's a concept of police legitimacy that people don't necessarily talk about. There has been some research on it. Anthony Bottoms and Justice Tankaby have done some research on the self-legitimacy stuff. And it really shows that internally, if the members are not being treated with procedural justice within their own organization, they are likely not going to do it when they leave the organization. If there's different expectations, whether it's fairness in promotion or jobs attained, pay, discipline, if the discipline that the members are getting is here, they're going to want to give that same type of discipline to the community. If the discipline is fair, they're going to want to give that same type of discipline to the community. So I think that there's two different prongs to that question. Does it differ with rank? I think it does. It differs with your rank and file members experiencing potentially the lack of procedural justice internally, and the concept of procedural justice, and it can be very, very different for me. I'm in my role as an inspector. I deal with a lot of NGO executive directors and community members that aren't necessarily in crisis. So for me, it's a little bit probably easier for me to go out and have that respectful conversation and have two-way participation. For a member in the middle of dealing with someone who is in a crisis after just watching their partner go into an opioid overdose, or someone who's currently having delusions as a result of methamphetamines, the concepts need to be there, but they have to be applied very differently, because officer safety has to still come to play.
And why would then procedural justice be important, specifically as it relates to modern challenges in policing, such as accountability, fairness, use of force, professionalism, etc.?
Well, and that's a great question, because when you actually look at the use of procedural justice, use of force goes down. So if you're dealing with people in that procedurally just manner, use of force goes down, so people comply more. There's more cooperation when the police are doing their work. The one keen research piece that's been researched over and over again by multiple people is less reoffending. When the police are seen as a legitimate power holder, the person who gets arrested actually will offend less. There's less resistance to police and less support for vigilante justice. So it becomes important because it actually is an operational benefit to the police. And I think that's where we've gapped, and I think that's where we've gapped in policing when it comes to evidence-based practices, is bringing that evidence to reality and ensuring that the police culture and the police leaders know that this is actually found in the evidence there. There's research that shows this occurs, and this is why it's important. And that's where we need to really bring that intersection of academia and policing to the forefront.
So then, shifting to a focus on police leaders, what would be some of the reasons as to why police leaders would need to pay high attention or high priority to police legitimacy and procedural justice?
So I will say this. The biggest crisis police are facing today is police legitimacy. If we look at the media, we talk about opioids, we talk about cannabis, we talk about numerous other things that are occurring. And when you really break it down, opioids isn't a police problem. We are part of the solution. We are part of hopefully impacting that. Cannabis isn't a police problem. We are part of the addressing the legalization, and we are part of the group, and we are the people that do the impaired driving for cannabis. But when we look at what is the biggest crisis in policing right now, it's really police legitimacy, and that's where police leaders need to focus. I go back to sexual violence again. I looked at the Unfounded article that was written by the Globe and Mail talking about sexual violence and unfounded allegations. And weaving through that was a lack of legitimacy in police. So when police aren't seen as legitimate, people are more victimized. They are reticent to call the police. And we are unable to protect and provide that public safety that's necessary. With procedural justice and police legitimacy being utmost important from the top down and from the bottom up, you can start seeing those impacts. And I think one of the things that police would have to do, though, is change the idea of increased numbers, looking at it as a negative. Recent Stats Canada in our jurisdiction showed that 56% of people had their homes broken in called the police. So they didn't need the file number, so they didn't expect that the police were going to do anything. So it's about rebuilding the trust that we don't have, and adding onto the trust and legitimacy that we do have, to actually further public safety and bring our members to a level of understanding the community that we can actually have impacts, and those impacts can be felt for years to come.
So you already touched upon evidence-based policing a little bit, but I was wondering if you could kind of expand a little bit more. So how can evidence-based policing play a role in procedural justice or even police legitimacy more broadly?
Evidence-based policing can play a role in that by showing and explaining through research and evidence the actual impacts and how the police can actually change their perception and how they're seen. The Queensland's community engagement trial is a good example of that. Another example, oddly enough, from Queensland was Debbie Platts. Debbie Platts was a master's degree student at Cambridge, and her whole goal was to reduce bias in her agency. She did a randomized control trial as well. And that randomized control trial, she was giving bias awareness presentations to half the class, and the other half the class at that time got interviewing skills. What ends up happening is when they do the post-test, they realize that everybody has increased in their bias. The people that got the bias awareness training increased less, but they all did. So what Debbie realized is what her research showed was her agency was actually taking people and they were leaving there more bias. And as a result of that, she's changed that. That will then build more police legitimacy, because that bias inherently decreases it, because that's how you go out and treat people in the community, specifically when you're dealing with marginalized populations, newcomer populations, those types of things. Having evidence to show police leaders that, hey, this is the research that's done in 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 different places when it comes to police legitimacy. This is what procedural justice can actually do. This is how bringing compassion into a competency in the organization can actually reduce complaints of service to the police. It can reduce offending. Those concepts together, well researched, actually make us have a safer community. The unfortunate thing, and Jeffrey Barnes said this recently, policing is 60 years behind where we should be in evidence-based practices. We, as a culture, for some reason, have resisted academia to assist us in our deployments, in knowing where to be, what to do, how to do it. Rather, it's kind of hunch-based, and we want to do it because this is how we've always done it, and we feel that we know. Policing feels that they know what's going on, because academics maybe haven't done the job. So how would they know?
Mm-hmm. So what has the research shown us, if any at all, about what works with respect to developing an officer's understanding of procedural justice? Is there any research out there that has done any of that?
That I haven't seen.
Okay.
Other than the probably the unintended consequence of the community Queensland community engagement trial, where the members were given a procedural justice script and it showed them how things were better. And even some of the pulling lever stuff would have an unintended consequences when the police went to the addresses in Philadelphia and actually had conversations with the high risk offenders, and they saw a 30% reduction in crime, and it wasn't enforcement based. So when you have these little things, but there's nothing that I know of that's specific to what works to developing that understanding.
Okay, so then what are some of your thoughts on what can be done to improve an agency's likelihood of embracing procedural justice? Is it training, or is it some other type of approach? What do you think?
I think education and training are hugely important. I think education on what procedural justice is, starting at the grassroots, I think it should be embedded in training. I would love to see a randomized control trial similar to what Debbie Platts did with recruits, and go, yeah, we're going to give these folks procedural justice training, and we're going to give these folks just the regular run-of-the-mill stuff, and then see how that progresses. That becomes sometimes the issue. Is that would be probably a longitudinal study that you could do over 10 years, and in 10 years from now we could say, look, this procedural justice stuff works all the way through, or it doesn't. Mm-hmm. But I think we know, and I think that's where the intersection of academia and policing comes into play, is we know the benefits of procedural justice and police legitimacy. They're well researched. They've been researched by multiple people in multiple countries, and it shows the same thing every time, that the more legitimate a police agency is seen, the less victimization there is, the less offending there is, less complaints against police. That's clear. Mm-hmm. What we need to do is take those, explain that to police leaders, and start that interject that training at the beginning. But this is the other kicker: is we have to weave that training throughout the entire population. Mm-hmm. Because if you just do it at the beginning, that's where their initial socialization. And if they get socialized later into the group, they lose the procedural justice stuff, because that's not how it's always been done. Mm-hmm. And cultural change in any organization is a challenge, and it would be a cultural change to make sure that police legitimacy and procedural justice are words that mean something, that we talk about, that police go, yeah, we need to treat people this way, because if we treat them this way, we're all going to be safer.
All right, Dan, so we worked through all the questions already. Do you have any final thoughts on procedural justice and police legitimacy?
No, I don't, unless you have any final questions for me.
No. All right, Dan, thanks so much. Thank you very much for taking part and taking time out of your day. And thank you to everyone who was able to tune in today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.